Cassie, Locke lived her life in a world of silent, beautiful ghosts. As one of the foremost art restorers in the country, her world was one of whispered secrets on aged canvas, of painstakingly reviving the brilliance of a master's stroke from under centuries of grime and neglect. Her studio, a sun-drenched loft in a converted Boston warehouse, was a sanctuary of smell, linseed oil, turpentine, and the faint, venerable scent of drying varnish. It was a life built on patience, precision, and a deep, abiding love for preserving beauty. This love had been kindled by her late uncle, Leo, a brilliant but unassuming art historian who had been more of a father to her than her own. Her life's anchor was her daughter, Sophia, a vibrant and talented art student. Cassie's greatest joy was their shared passion, their weekends spent wandering museums, speaking in the quiet, reverent language of color and composition. The disruption of Cassie's peaceful world came in the form of Adrian Volkov. Charming, sophisticated, and effortlessly handsome, Adrian was a rising star in the cutthroat world of international art dealing. He swept Sophia off her feet with his knowledge of the very masters Cassie devoted her life to. He spoke of Sotheby's and Christie's with a casual familiarity that impressed them both. To Cassie, he initially seemed like a perfect match, a man who would cherish her daughter's artistic soul. The conspiracy was subtle. It began with Adrian expressing concern about Cassie's precarious freelance work. "You deserve security, Cassie," he'd say, his voice dripping with false concern. "All this stress isn't good for you. What if something happens? Sophia worries so much." He then introduced his cousin, a slick lawyer named Dmitri. Over a series of cozy family dinners, Dmitri expertly spun a tale of worry and future planning. "A simple living trust," he explained, his smile disarmingly warm. "It would protect your assets, ensure a smooth transition for Sophia. It's what families do. We take care of each other." Worn down by their united front of concern and blinded by her desire to see Sophia secure and happy, Cassie signed the complex documents Dmitri put in front of her. It felt like an act of love, of family unity. She was, after all, entrusting her life's work to her daughter and the man who loved her. The betrayal was executed with brutal efficiency. The very next week, a team of movers arrived at her studio. They were polite but firm, armed with paperwork stating that the assets of the Locke family trust were being consolidated for management. They took everything: her brushes, her pigments, the half-restored 18th century portrait on her easel, and her heart stopped, the unassuming wooden crate containing her current project. A badly damaged, soot-blackened painting from a minor European church, its acquisition paid for with the last of her personal savings. When she called Sophia, frantic, her daughter's voice was cold, distant. "Mom, it's for the best. Adrian is handling everything. You need to rest." The final, cruel twist came at the gala. Adrian, leveraging his new assets, had secured a prestigious curator position at a major museum. The opening exhibition was his triumph. Consumed by a desperate need for answers, Cassie used an old staff pass to get in. She found Adrian holding court in the center of the main gallery. And there, on a restored easel under a spotlight, was her painting. But it was no longer the damaged relic she knew. It had been vulgarly, hastily restored. The subtle, masterful work was gone, overpainted with garish, modern colors. It was a butchering. Adrian spotted her. A smirk touched his lips as he led Sophia over. "Cassandra, so glad you could make it. I see you're admiring the centerpiece of my new exhibition, a recently discovered masterpiece, rescued from obscurity." He put a possessive arm around Sophia, who looked at her mother with a mixture of pity and embarrassment. "Adrian is a genius, Mom," Sophia said, her voice too loud. "He sees value where others just see old junk." In that moment, surrounded by the glittering crowd and the grotesque parody of her life's work, Cassie was no longer a person. She was a problem they had efficiently solved. She turned and fled, the sound of their laughter echoing in her ears. The money from the trust was a pittance, a monthly allowance Adrian doled out like a warden. She was a prisoner in a small, bleak apartment, her world reduced to four white walls, the ghosts of her art silenced. Her salvation arrived in the form of a forgotten digital backup. In her despair, she scrolled through old cloud files, looking for photos of happier times. She found a folder of high-resolution scans she'd made of the junk painting before Adrian took it. It was a compulsive act of documentation, a restorer's habit. Zooming in on a section of the scan, a faint, ghostly image hidden beneath the grime caught her eye. It was a signature. A signature that made her blood run cold. It wasn't the signature of the mediocre artist they'd attributed it to. It was the distinct, looping script of Amdio Modigliani. The painting wasn't junk. It was a lost masterpiece, potentially worth over $50 million. Adrian must have suspected. He hadn't just wanted her assets. He had wanted this specific painting, and he needed her legal ownership of it to make his theft legitimate. But Adrian had made a fatal mistake. He had been greedy and impatient. He'd overpainted it, irrevocably damaging a national treasure in his rush to claim it as his own discovery. And Cassie had the proof. A cold, focused fury replaced her despair. The patient hands of the restorer were now the instruments of a meticulous revenge. Her first move was to a young, fiercely ethical art blogger, Lena Petrova, who had previously written about restoration ethics. Cassie anonymously sent her the high-resolution scan, highlighting the hidden signature and the tragic, garish after photos from the museum's website. The blog post that followed was explosive. The Modigliani scandal. Butchery for profit at the highest level? The art world erupted in outrage. The museum was thrown into chaos. Her second move was legal. She found a lawyer who specialized in art law and intellectual property. The Living Trust was a sham, a predatory document that transferred ownership under false pretenses. Her case was strong. The final act was a public confrontation. At a press conference called by the museum to address the scandal, Cassie walked in. She was no longer the broken woman from the gala. She stood straight, her voice clear and steady as she laid out the entire sordid story. The manipulation, the theft, the legal fraud, and the destruction of a priceless work of art. She presented the evidence. The scans, the damning legal documents, the timeline of the betrayal. She spoke not with anger, but with the devastating precision of a master restorer revealing a masterpiece hidden beneath a cheap forgery. Adrian was arrested for fraud and art destruction. Sophia, finally seeing the monstrous truth, broke down in tears, begging for forgiveness. The victory was bittersweet. The Modigliani was tragically damaged, though experts believed Cassie's original scans could guide a true restoration. The trust was dissolved, her assets returned. But Cassie Locke was changed. She opened a new studio, not just for restoration, but as a foundation to advocate for ethical art dealing and to protect artists from predators like Adrian Volkov. She had gone into the darkness to rescue a lost masterpiece and had emerged not just with a painting, but with a new, powerful purpose: to be the restorer of justice in a world that had forgotten its value. The fallout from the press conference was immediate and absolute. Adrian Volkov's world, a carefully constructed edifice of charm, lies, and stolen prestige, crumbled into dust within hours. The museum terminated his contract, citing egregious breaches of ethics and fiduciary duty. His arrest, captured by a dozen news cameras, was a spectacle of humiliating downfall. The art world's golden boy led away in handcuffs, his expensive suit looking like a cheap costume. For Cassandra Locke, the victory was a cold, quiet thing. There were no celebrations. The return of her assets, her studio, and her tools felt less like a triumph and more like a restoration of a crime scene. Every brush, every jar of medium, every smell of the studio was a reminder of the trust that had been so violently violated. The Modigliani, her Modigliani, was now evidence, locked away in a high-security conservation lab. Experts confirmed her worst fears. Adrian's crude overpainting had caused significant, and in some areas, irreversible damage. The masterpiece she had painstakingly documented was now a patient on the critical list, its survival uncertain. The most profound silence, however, was the one from her daughter. Sophia's tearful plea for forgiveness at the press conference was followed by a vacuum. Days turned into weeks without a word. Cassie's phone remained silent, her apartment door unanswered. The hurt was a physical weight on her chest. She had exposed the monster, but in doing so, she feared she had annihilated her daughter's world and any chance of reconciliation. Her new purpose, the Locke Foundation for Artistic Ethics, became her refuge. It was a small, scrappy operation, run out of her studio with Lena Petrova, the fierce art blogger, as her deputy. They were inundated with letters. Heartbreaking stories poured in from elderly artists tricked out of their life's work, from young creators exploited by greedy galleries, from families who had lost inheritances to smooth-talking predators like Adrian. Cassie realized her case wasn't unique, it was a symptom of a sickness in the art world. Her revenge was no longer personal, it had morphed into a crusade. It was during this time that a letter arrived from Italy. It was from a Father Massimo, the priest of the small parish church from which the damaged painting had originally come. He had seen the news. His letter was not angry, but filled with a profound, gentle sadness. He wrote of his parishioners' devastation, not at the loss of a potential fortune, but at the desecration of their beloved cultural heritage, a piece of their community's soul that had survived wars and famine, only to be destroyed by greed in a sterile museum. The letter shattered Cassie's remaining walls. She had been focused on the art, the money, the betrayal. Father Massimo made her see the human cost, the broken faith of a whole community. She knew what she had to do. She petitioned the courts, arguing that as the rightful owner and the world's leading expert on the painting's true state, she should lead the restoration effort. The legal battle was brief. The prosecution, eager to see the masterpiece saved, and the Italian government, supporting the church's claim, agreed. Cassandra Locke was granted stewardship of the ruined Modigliani. The restoration would be a monumental, potentially years-long task. It would be conducted in a specially built clean room at the Boston Museum of Fine Arts, a condition of the loan. It would be a public act of penance for the museum and a very public testament for Cassie's foundation. Every day, visitors would be able to watch through a glass wall as she worked. The day she walked into the clean room was one of the most daunting of her life. The painting sat on the easel, a grotesque shadow of itself. Under the unforgiving glare of the conservation lights, Adrian's garish colors screamed. This was no longer about proving a point or winning a fight. This was an act of resurrection, and she would have to do it with the whole world watching. Weeks bled into months. Her life became a ritual of solitude and intense focus. She would arrive before dawn and leave long after dark. The work was agonizingly slow. Using her original high-resolution scans as a divine map, she began the microscopic process of dissolving Adrian's modern paint without harming the fragile original beneath. It was a psychological ordeal. Every swipe of the solvent-soaked cotton swab was an erasure of his violation, a reclamation of her own expertise. She wasn't just restoring a painting, she was restoring herself. One afternoon, deep in the zone of hyperfocus, she became aware of a presence on the other side of the glass. She didn't need to look up to know who it was, she could feel it. Sophia. She kept working, her hands steady, her breathing even. She would not chase, she would not plead. After a long moment, the door to the antechamber opened with a soft hiss. Sophia stood there, dressed simply, her face pale and stripped of the glamour Adrian had demanded. She didn't speak. She just watched her mother's hands, the precise, patient movements that she had seen her whole life. The silence was heavy with everything unsaid, the apologies, the accusations, the grief. Finally, Sophia's voice, small and broken, broke the silence. I thought he was saving me from all of this. She gestured vaguely at the tools, the solvents, the solitary, painstaking work, from a life of quiet struggle. I thought he was sophistication. He made your world seem small. Cassie paused, setting down her tool. She finally looked at her daughter, really looked at her. She saw not the traitor, but the scared, impressionable girl who had been seduced by a glittering illusion. It is small, Cassie said, her voice quiet but clear in the sterile room. It's a world of tiny details, of patience, of listening to something older and wiser than yourself. It's not a world of millions, Sophia, it's a world of meaning. And that is infinitely larger. Tears streamed down Sophia's face. The dam broke. The story poured out, how Adrian had isolated her, how he'd subtly undermined her relationship with her mother, painting Cassie as a jealous, fading woman. He'd promised her a life of influence and glamour, a world away from the smell of turpentine. She had been a pawn, and the shame of realizing it had been paralyzing. I'm so sorry, Mom. I don't expect you to forgive me. Forgiveness isn't a switch, Sophia, Cassie said, picking up her tool again. It's a process like this. She gestured to the painting. It's slow, it's messy, and some damage leaves a permanent mark. But that doesn't mean you stop trying to restore what was lost. It was not absolution, but it was a beginning. A fragile thread of connection, spun in the silent, sacred space of the clean room. Sophia started visiting regularly. At first, she just watched. Then she began to ask questions, tentative, intelligent questions about the process, about Modigliani's technique. The shared language of art, dormant for so long, began to reawaken. Cassie, sensing a chance to rebuild something truer, started teaching her. She showed her how to mix a traditional medium, how to identify the type of brushstroke. It was an apprenticeship not just in restoration, but in integrity. News of the collaboration leaked. The image of the mother and daughter, working together to heal the very masterpiece that had been used to tear them apart, became a powerful symbol. Donations to the Locke Foundation tripled. The restoration of the Modigliani took almost 2 years. The day it was unveiled to the public and returned to the tiny Italian church was a global event. Cassie and Sophia stood beside Father Massimo as he wept with joy. The painting was home. It was not pristine. The scars of its ordeal were still visible to a trained eye, but that was part of its story now. A story of resilience. Back in Boston, Cassie's studio was once again filled with light and the smell of oils. But it was different. Sophia was there, her own easel set up in a corner, finding her own voice as an artist, no longer chasing someone else's idea of prestige. The Locke Foundation was thriving, a respected watchdog and a sanctuary for exploited artists. One evening, as they were cleaning brushes, Sophia looked at her mother. "He took so much from us," she said softly. Cassie looked around the studio, at her daughter's strong, paint-stained hands, at the letters of thanks on her desk. She thought of the Modigliani, back in its church, a testament to survival. "No, my love," Cassie said, a deep, hard-won peace in her voice. "He just thought he did. In the end, he gave us everything." The return of the Modigliani to its small Italian parish church was not merely a restitution. It was a pilgrimage. For Cassandra Locke, the journey to the sun-baked hill town of Santa Lucia felt like the closing of a sacred circle. The painting, now secured behind climate-controlled, non-reflective glass, was reinstalled above the simple stone altar where it had resided for centuries before its near destruction. The ceremony was a profound mixture of solemn mass and joyous festival. The entire village turned out, their faces etched with a reverence that had nothing to do with the painting's monetary value and everything to do with its place in the soul of their community. Father Massimo, his voice thick with emotion, did not praise Cassie for recovering a masterpiece worth tens of millions. Instead, he thanked her for returning their compagno, their companion, who had shared in their sorrows and joys. An elderly woman, her hands gnarled from a lifetime of work, approached Cassie and pressed a small, warm loaf of bread into her hands. "Per ti, ci hai portato a casa il nostro cuor," she whispered. "For you, who brought our heart home." In that moment, standing in the ancient church, surrounded by the raw, unfiltered gratitude of the people, Cassie felt the last vestiges of the cold, metallic anger that had fueled her for 2 years finally melt away. She had not just won a battle, she had performed an act of healing that stretched across an ocean. The return to Boston was a return to a new reality. The Locke Foundation for Artistic Ethics had, in her absence, evolved from a reactive cause into a formidable institution. Lena Petrova had proven to be a brilliant, if fiercely uncompromising, executive director. Donations had not just tripled, they had flooded in from every corner of the globe, from horrified art lovers and philanthropists who saw Cassie's story as a catalyst for sweeping change. They now had the resources to take on systemic corruption, not just individual cases. Their first major target was the very ecosystem that had enabled Adrian Volkov. The network of authentication boards, lax insurers, and complicit auction houses that turned a blind eye to provenance gaps for a slice of the astronomical profits. Lena, a digital sleuth by nature, had assembled a team of forensic art historians, data analysts, and retired federal investigators. Their war room was no longer Cassie's studio, but a sleek, secure office downtown, its walls covered in timelines and linked charts mapping the flow of forged and misattributed works. Cassie's role shifted from restorer-in-chief to visionary leader and public face. She testified before congressional subcommittees on art fraud, her quiet, authoritative voice a stark contrast to the bluster of the lobbyists arrayed against her. She found she had a talent for it. The same patience that allowed her to spend months on a single square inch of canvas allowed her to dismantle a hostile senator's argument with forensic precision. The press dubbed her the restorer of truth. Yet, amidst this very public crusade, her most important work was happening in the private, hallowed space of her studio. Her relationship with Sophia was the true masterpiece in need of ongoing, delicate restoration. The trust between them remained a fragile thing, like a newly mended ceramic, able to hold water but not yet withstand a fall. Sophia had thrown herself into her work at the foundation with a convert zeal, managing their growing social media presence and curating stories from exploited artists. But Cassie saw the lingering shame in her daughter's eyes, the flinch when a particularly difficult case involving emotional manipulation would cross her desk. She was trying to earn an absolution she felt she didn't deserve. The tension between them crystallized around a new case. A renowned sculptor from Detroit, a bear of a man named Elijah Jones, contacted the foundation. His life's work, A series of powerful, large-scale bronze figures depicting the Great Migration had been stolen from him not by a lover, but by his own gallery. They had used a labyrinthine contract to claim ownership of the sculptures, the molds, and even the very concepts, relegating Elijah to a mere fabricator, while they sold his soul for millions. He was not just battling for his art, he was battling to reclaim his own history. Lena was ready to declare war. She wanted a public campaign, a blistering documentary, a full-bore legal assault. Sophia, however, surprised everyone. She had been quietly working with Elijah for weeks. A public war is what they want, Sophia argued in a strategy meeting. Her voice, once hesitant, was now firm. They're prepared for it. They have the lawyers, the PR firms. They'll paint Elijah as greedy, difficult, an opportunist riding our coattails. We need to be smarter. She laid out a plan that was subtle, patient, and brilliant. It was a strategy of containment and psychological pressure. Instead of suing the gallery first, they would systematically dismantle its reputation. They would use the Foundation's platform to launch a curated series on the true faces of American art, quietly featuring Elijah's work and his story without ever mentioning the gallery's name. They would lobby museums to quietly remove their donations from upcoming exhibitions. They would use their new connections in the insurance world to make the gallery's premium skyrocket. They would make the gallery toxic, not through a loud explosion, but through 1,000 silent cuts. Lena, the warrior, was skeptical. Cassie watched her daughter, seeing not the betrayed young woman, but a strategist emerging, her painful experience with Adrian giving her a unique insight into the mind of a predator. She was using patience as a weapon. Sophia is right, Cassie said, her voice ending the debate. We will fight this fire with water, not more fire. We will drown them in silence and bureaucracy. The strategy was agonizingly slow. Elijah, a man of passion and immediate emotion, struggled with the lack of a public fight. But Sophia worked with him daily, her calm resolve steadying his nerves. She became his protector, his interpreter of this new, cold form of warfare. The victory, when it came, was as quiet as their strategy. Facing financial ruin from soaring insurance costs and a complete freeze-out from the legitimate art world, the gallery settled. They returned everything to Elijah. The sculptures, the molds, the rights. There was no press release, no triumphant announcement. The victory was in the silence. That night, Elijah arrived at the Foundation's office with a bottle of whiskey and a single, small maquette of one of his figures. He presented it to Sophia. You gave me back my voice, kid, he said, his own voice rough with emotion. They stole it with a contract. You gave it back with patience. It was Sophia's turn to cry. The maquette wasn't just a gift. It was a symbol that she was no longer the victim or the traitor. She was a restorer, too. She had helped mend a broken man's legacy. This private triumph was followed by a public one. A major museum, inspired by the Foundation's work, announced a groundbreaking new exhibit, The Art of the Deal, Ownership, Exploitation, and Reclamation in the Modern Art World. It was to be co-curated by Cassandra Locke and would feature the stories of Elijah, Cassie, and dozens of others. The centerpiece would be the restored Modigliani, on loan from Santa Lucia, displayed not as a solitary masterpiece, but as the ultimate example of art that had been exploited, fought for, and ultimately returned to its rightful cultural home. The planning was a whirlwind. Cassie and Sophia traveled to New York for meetings, their relationship now eased into a comfortable, professional rhythm. It was during a scouting trip to the museum's massive storage vaults that they found it. Tucked away in a forgotten corner, behind a rack of decommissioned exhibit displays, was a large canvas faced to the wall. It was dusty, its frame chipped. Something about its size and the faint pattern on the frame's backing felt eerily familiar to Cassie. With a curator's permission, they carefully turned it around. Cassie's breath caught in her throat. It was a portrait. A woman in a deep emerald gown, her expression one of profound, haunting sadness. The painting was badly damaged. A long, ugly tear ran through the center of the canvas, and it was shrouded in a thick layer of grime. But the style was unmistakable. It was the work of her Uncle Leo. She had only ever seen photographs of this piece. It was called The Widow's Vigil. It was his masterpiece, the painting he had been working on when he died suddenly. The painting that had vanished from his studio shortly after his death, a loss that had haunted her family for decades. Her mother had always believed his landlord had sold it to cover unpaid rent. Seeing it here, neglected and wounded in a museum basement, felt like a physical blow. The curator checked the records. The painting had been donated decades ago by a collector who had since passed away. The paperwork was sparse, listing it only as School of Boston, 20th century. Its provenance was a ghost story. For Cassie, it was a direct message from the past, a new secret to uncover, a new wrong to right. But as she looked at Sophia, whose eyes were wide with the same awe and recognition, she knew this was not her battle to fight alone. "We have to restore it," Sophia whispered, her hand instinctively reaching out to touch the damaged canvas, then pulling back as if it were sacred. "We will," Cassie said, her voice steady. "But first, we need to find out how it got here. This isn't just about art. This is about Uncle Leo. This is about our family." The Modigliani had been a battle for justice. The widow's vigil felt like a quest for truth. The public exhibition, the foundation's work, the fight against corruption, it all continued. But now, mother and daughter had a private mission, a shared secret that bound them together more powerfully than any public victory ever could. They had found a lost piece of their own soul, and together they would uncover the story of its disappearance and bring it, and their family, finally back into the light. The work of restoration, it seemed, was never truly done. It simply found new, deeper forms. The discovery of the Widow's Vigil in the museum's storage vault was more than an art historical find. It was an archaeological dig into the deepest layers of Cassandra Locke's own history. The painting was a ghost, a silent witness to her Uncle Leo's final, frustrated days, and to the unresolved grief that had shaped her own life. The fact that it had been hiding in plain sight, misattributed and forgotten, felt like a personal affront, a wound that had been left to fester for decades. The immediate urge was to take it, to rush it back to Boston, and begin the delicate work of restoration. But Cassie, tempered by her battles with Adrian Volkov and the labyrinthine art world, knew that haste was the enemy of truth. This wasn't just about healing canvas, it was about uncovering a story. They needed to proceed with forensic precision. The first step was legal. The museum, deeply embarrassed that a work by Leo Locke, a painter whose posthumous reputation had grown significantly, had languished in their basement, was eager to cooperate. They signed over temporary custody to the Locke Foundation for research and authentication purposes, a neatly vague term that gave Cassie and her team wide latitude. The second step was a scientific one. They had the painting transported not to Cassie's studio, but to a state of the art conservation lab at Harvard, where non invasive testing could be conducted. Under the cool gaze of hyperspectral cameras and X ray fluorescence spectrometers, the widow's vigil began to give up its secrets. The results were staggering. The X rays revealed something hidden beneath the surface of the painting, a second, completely different composition. It was a bustling, chaotic street scene filled with figures that seemed to be arguing, their faces twisted in anger. It was painted with a raw, violent energy utterly unlike the melancholic refinement of the widow above it. Leo had painted over it. "Why?" Sophia breathed, staring at the ghostly image on the computer screen. "Why would he cover this?" "It's powerful." "It's angry," Cassie corrected, her restorer's eye analyzing the brushwork. "This was painted in a fury. The piece on top, that was painted in sorrow. He wasn't just creating a new painting. He was burying an old one." The spectral analysis provided another clue. The emerald pigment of the widow's gown was exceptionally pure and rare for its time, a specific variant manufactured by a small, now-defunct Italian firm. Cassie's research into the firm's ledgers, a painstaking process of digging through digital archives, revealed that this particular batch had been purchased by only one entity in Boston in that era, the Aldrich Museum of American Art. The Aldrich, the name hit Cassie like a physical blow. It was one of the city's oldest and most respected private museums, a temple to gilded age, wealth, and taste. Its current director was a man named Alastair Finch, a pillar of the establishment, a man who had written a glowing introduction for the catalog of Adrian Volkov's ill-fated exhibition. The pieces began to form a troubling mosaic. Her uncle Leo had been a young, idealistic artist, fiercely critical of the commercial art world. The Aldrich, then run by Alastair's formidable grandfather, was the epitome of that world. What had happened between them? The answer, they suspected, lay with the painting's donor. The museum's records were frustratingly sparse, bequest of the estate of Eleanor Vance. Who was Eleanor Vance? A search of public records, obituaries, and social archives revealed nothing. It was as if the woman had never existed. It was Lena Petrova, leveraging her dark web data mining skills, who found the crack in the facade. Eleanor Vance wasn't a collector. She was a secretary. She had worked for the Aldrich Museum for over 40 years, a quiet, efficient woman who had never married and had no known family. Her will was a simple, one-page document leaving her modest estate to a local animal shelter. The painting was not listed among her assets. So, how did a museum secretary come to possess a valuable Locke painting, and why did she donate it anonymously to a different museum? Lena mused, her fingers flying across her keyboard. This stinks of a payoff of hush money. The theory was compelling but circumstantial. They needed a witness, a document, something to connect the Aldrich to Leo, to the painting, to a leaner Vance. Sophia, who had been quietly cross-referencing dates from Leo's old appointment books with the Aldrich's exhibition schedules from the 1970s, made the breakthrough. Look, she said, her voice tense with excitement. The Aldrich hosted a major regional exhibition, New England Perspectives, in the fall of 1975. Uncle Leo's journal says he submitted The Widow's Vigil, but his name doesn't appear in the catalog. The show was curated by a junior curator named Charles Finch, Alastair Finch's father. The journal entries after that date grew increasingly despondent. Leo wrote of betrayal, of stolen ideas, of a silence that has been purchased. The last entry, written a week before his fatal heart attack, was a single, cryptic line. Evie knows the truth, but truth is a luxury she cannot afford. Evie Aliner Vance. The trail, cold for decades, was now warm. Cassie made a decision. She would go to the Aldrich, not with accusations, but with a request. The foundation was planning a major retrospective on overlooked New England artists of the 20th century. They wished to include Leo Locke and needed to consult the Aldrich's archives regarding his submission to the 1975 exhibition. It was a perfectly legitimate, polite request. Alastair Finch received her in his opulent, wood-paneled office. He was a man in his late 60s, with the patrician grace of old money and a smile that didn't reach his cold, assessing eyes. Cassandra Locke, he said, gesturing to a leather armchair. The avenging angel of the art world. To what do I owe the pleasure? Come to audit our collection for stolen masterpieces? His tone was light, mocking, but his gaze was wary. Cassie laid out her fabricated request, her voice calm and professional. Finch listened, steepling his fingers. 1975? That's ancient history. I'm afraid our archives from that period are a mess, unorganized. It would be a hopeless task. The Locke Foundation is happy to provide an archivist, Cassie offered smoothly. As a courtesy to your staff, the suggestion hung in the air. Finch's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. That won't be necessary. I'll have my assistant take a look. Though I must warn you, my father wasn't the most fastidious record keeper. I doubt you'll find anything of interest. It was a dismissal. As Cassie rose to leave, her eye caught a photograph on his desk. A much younger Charles Finch standing proudly next to a painting. Her blood ran cold. It was the widow's vigil, but not as she knew it. In the photo, the tear was gone. The painting was pristine. And in the lower corner, clear as day, was a signature that was not her uncle's. It was a name she didn't recognize. Finch followed her gaze. For a fraction of a second, panic flashed in his eyes before being replaced by icy composure. A forgotten talent, he said dismissively, moving to turn the photograph face down. One of many. The meeting was over. Cassie walked out of the Aldrich, her heart pounding. They hadn't just rejected Leo's painting. They had stolen it. Charles Finch had exhibited it under another artist's name. The real artist had died weeks later, heartbroken and penniless. And Alina Vance, the secretary, had been paid to take the painting and make it disappear forever. The ugly street scene hidden beneath the widow was Leo's raw anger at the establishment. The widow herself was his grief at what they had made him do, bury his own truth under a more palatable, saleable lie. The battle lines were drawn. But the Aldrich was not a lone predator like Adrian Volkov. It was an institution, a fortress of money, influence, and tradition. Taking it on was not a fight, it was a war. The next month was a whirlwind of covert activity. The foundation operated on two tracks. The public track was the planning of the massive Art of the Deal exhibition, a project that required them to maintain a cordial, professional relationship with the Aldrich and other major museums. The private track was a shadow campaign. Lena and her team dug deeper into the Aldrich's finances, looking for the payment to a leaner Vance. Sophia, using her newfound strategic patience, began quietly reaching out to other artists and scholars who had crossed paths with the Aldrich in the 70s and 80s, building a network of whispered grievances and long-held suspicions. Cassie, meanwhile, focused on the painting itself. The key was the signature in the photograph. Who was the artist whose name had been forged? Their research led them to a dead end, a minor landscape painter who had died in the 1950s. Charles Finch hadn't just stolen the painting, he had created a phantom artist to claim it. The stress was immense. The foundation was operating at its limits. Cassie saw the toll it was taking on Sophia, the dark circles under her eyes, the return of her nervous flinch. One evening, she found Sophia in the lab, staring at the X-ray image of the angry street scene. He must have felt so alone, Sophia said quietly. They took his work, his name, and then he died. And we never knew. She turned to Cassie, her eyes glistening. We can't let them get away with this, Mom. We can't. In that moment, Cassie realized this was no longer just about justice for Leo. This was about Sophia's redemption. This was her way of fighting the same kind of predatory greed that had ensnared her, of proving that the quiet, patient work of truth could topple even the mightiest fortress. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source, the animal shelter. Lena, on a hunch, had contacted them. The elderly director remembered Eleanor Vance well. A lovely, quiet woman, she said, very devoted to the cats. She passed away about 10 years ago. But after she died, we found a box of her personal effects she'd left in storage here. We were going to throw it out, but we never got around to it. The box was a time capsule. Inside were ledgers from the Aldrich, meticulously detailing petty cash disbursements. And there it was, an entry for November 12, 1975. Disbursement to E. Vance, $5,000 for special services rendered. CF approval. A fortune for a secretary in 1975. Hush money. But the real treasure was at the bottom of the box, a small, leather-bound diary. Eleanor Vance's private thoughts. The entries were brief, often sad, detailing a lonely life. But the entry for November 12, 1975 was different. CF gave me an envelope of cash today, more money than I make in a year. He told me to take the painting from the storage room, the angry one by that nice Mr. Locke that his father rejected. He told me to keep it safe and never speak of it. He said it was for the reputation of the museum. Mr. Locke came by later. He looked ill. He knew what we had done. I tried to explain, but he just looked at me with such disappointment. He said, "You were the only one who ever seemed to see the art, Eleanor, not just the price tag. I will never forget the shame. I have sold my soul for a comfortable silence." It was all there. The coercion, the theft, the crushing of a talented artist. Charles Finch's crime, and Eleanor Vance's lifelong guilt. They had them. The unveiling was not a press conference. It was a coup de theater staged at the opening night gala of the Art of the Deal exhibition. The museum was packed with the elite of the art world. Alastair Finch was there, holding court, the picture of patrician benevolence. The evening's climax was a scheduled talk by Cassie about the Modigliani. As she took the podium, the image of the restored masterpiece shone behind her. She spoke eloquently about restoration, about truth, about the need for the art world to confront its own complicity in exploitation. Then she paused. But restoration isn't just about the past, she said, her voice dropping, commanding the room's absolute attention. It's about the present. It's about having the courage to uncover truths that powerful people wish to keep buried, truths that destroy lives and legacies. The screen behind her changed. It showed the X-ray of the widow's vigil, the angry street scene visible beneath the surface. A gasp went through the crowd. Then it showed the photograph from Finch's desk, the painting with the forged signature, then the ledger entry, then a scan of Eleanor Vance's diary entry. Cassie didn't need to accuse, the documents did it for her. She simply narrated the story, her voice calm and devastatingly clear. She spoke of Leo Locke, not as a famous artist, but as her uncle, a kind man who loved art and died with a broken heart. The silence in the room was absolute. Every eye was fixed on Alastair Finch, whose face had turned a ghastly shade of gray. He looked like a man watching his entire world, built on a lie generations deep, evaporate before his eyes. There were no shouted denials, no dramatic confrontations. The evidence was too overwhelming. The edifice of his family's respectability crumbled into dust in the span of 5 minutes. The fallout was swift and merciless. Alastair Finch resigned from the Aldrich by morning. The museum's board issued a groveling public apology and announced an independent investigation into its historical practices. The art world was rocked to its core. In the aftermath, Cassie and Sophia returned to the studio. The real widow's vigil now sat on Cassie's easel, its tear finally mended, its surface carefully cleaned. The sorrowful woman in green seemed to gaze out at them, her vigil finally over. Sophia picked up a brush, loaded it with a tiny dot of inpainting medium, and looked at her mother. Cassie nodded. Together, side by side, they began the work of restoring not just a painting, but a name, a legacy, and a family. The war was over. The quiet, patient work of healing could finally begin. The silence in the studio after the Aldrich's fall was different from any that had come before. It wasn't the silence of defeat, of loneliness, or even of intense concentration. It was the quiet, humming stillness of a world set right. The air, once thick with the ghosts of betrayal and the sharp scent of solvents used for erasing lies, now smelled simply of potential. Of gesso and clean linseed oil, and the faint, sweet smell of the tea Sophia had taken to making for them both in the afternoons. The restoration of the widow's vigil became their shared liturgy. With the truth now exposed to the world, the pressure was gone. They weren't working against a deadline or an enemy. They were working for Leo, for themselves. Each minute stroke of the brush to inpaint the damaged sections was an act of communion with the uncle and grandfather neither had truly known. Cassie would talk as she worked, telling Sophia stories about Leo's terrible jokes, his love of bad Chinese food, the way he could get lost for hours in the way light fell on a dusty windowsill. Sophia, in turn, began to share her own memories, not of Adrian, but of the long afternoons she'd spent in the same studio as a child, watching her mother perform what had then seemed like magic. The dynamic between them had irrevocably shifted. Sophia was no longer the penitent apprentice. She was a partner. Her strategic mind, honed in the fight against the Aldrich, began to envision the future of the Locke Foundation not just as a watchdog, but as a beacon. "We've been reactive," she said one afternoon, sitting back from the nearly finished painting and studying it with a critical eye. "We wait for the Elijah Joneses of the world to find us. What if we go on the offensive? What if we create something they can't ignore?" Her idea was ambitious: the Locke Protocol, a voluntary certification for galleries, auction houses, and museums that adhered to a strict ethical code of conduct regarding artist rights, provenance transparency, and fair contracts. Those who signed on would be audited by the foundation and receive a seal of approval, a mark that would become a powerful signal to ethical collectors and artists. Lena loved it. "We can weaponize market forces," she said, her eyes gleaming. "Make ethics profitable, make corruption expensive." The launch of the Locke Protocol was a media sensation. Major institutions, desperate to regain public trust after the Aldrich scandal, clamored to be among the first to sign. The Foundation's offices downtown became a hub of legitimate activity, a world away from the shadowy war room it had been during the Aldrich investigation. They were now builders, not just demolition experts. Amidst this flurry of positive change, a letter arrived. It was from a small arts council in a struggling post-industrial town in the Midwest. They had read about the protocol. They didn't have a gallery to certify or a masterpiece to authenticate. They had a town full of closed factories, unemployed youth, and a desperate need for hope. They asked a simple question: "Can your foundation help us restore our community?" The request sat on Cassie's desk for a week. It didn't fit into any of their new categories. It wasn't about fraud or legal battles. It was about something far more fundamental. It was Sophia who saw the opportunity. "This is it, Mom," she said, her voice filled with a new kind of excitement. "This is what the protocol is for. It's not just a stamp for the big museums. It's a set of principles. What if we go there? Not to audit, but to help them build something new, a community arts center. We can use our network, our influence to get them supplies, teachers. We can show them how to tell their own story." It was a risk. It was a distraction from their core mission. It was also the most purely altruistic thing they had ever considered. They went. Cassie, Sophia, and a small team from the foundation arrived in the tired town of Millville. The project was messy, frustrating, and utterly glorious. They worked with local carpenters to renovate a shuttered textile mill. They held town halls, listening to stories of loss and resilience. Sophia, to Cassie's immense pride, became the project's heart, her innate empathy and organizational genius shining as she coordinated volunteers and managed the complex logistics. Cassie found herself teaching a class on mural painting to a group of skeptical teenagers. At first, they were silent, closed off. But as she showed them how to mix colors, how to scale a small drawing to a vast wall, they began to open up. They told her about their town, their families, their fears. The mural they designed together wasn't pretty. It was raw, powerful, a stark depiction of the town industrial past crashing into an uncertain but defiant future. The day the Millville Community Arts Center opened, the entire town turned out. There was music, food, and an overwhelming sense of collective pride. The mayor gave a speech, but the real moment came when a young girl, maybe 10 years old, presented Cassie and Sophia with a small, clumsily woven bracelet. "Thank you for helping us make our place beautiful," she whispered. On the train back to Boston, Sophia was quiet, looking out at the passing countryside. "I finally get it," she said softly. "I always thought what you did was about the past, restoring old things. But it's not. It's about the future. It's about giving people the tools to create their own value, to tell their own stories. That's the real restoration." Cassie felt a swell of emotion so powerful it stole her breath. Her daughter wasn't just her partner. She was her successor. She had taken the principles of their painstaking, detail-oriented work and had applied them on a human scale, with more compassion and vision than Cassie had ever dared to. The final stage of their journey began with a formal offer. The directorship of the Aldrich Museum was now vacant. The board, in a stunning move, offered the position to Cassandra Locke. It was the ultimate victory, the ultimate vindication. She could walk into that fortress of old money and tradition, not as a supplicant, but as its commander. She could reshape it from the inside out. Everyone expected her to accept. Lena already had a list of reforms to implement. The art world held its breath, waiting to see the avenging angel take her throne. Cassie spent a long night walking through the silent rooms of her studio. She looked at the restored Widow's Vigil, now radiant and whole. She looked at the small maquette from Elijah Jones. She looked at the woven bracelet from Millville. The next morning, she declined the offer. "The Aldrich needs new leadership," she told a stunned board over the phone. "But it doesn't need me. My work isn't inside institutions anymore. It's out here." Her work, she had realized, was a studio, not an office. It was a foundation that was becoming a movement. It was a daughter who had found her purpose. It was a quiet, patient revolution fought one brushstroke, one contract, one community at a time. The news of her refusal sent a different kind of shockwave through the art world. It wasn't a shock of scandal, but of profound respect. She had rejected the crown because she valued the work more than the title. The Locke Foundation's influence grew exponentially. The protocol became the industry standard. But its heart remained in the studio. Cassie took on fewer restoration projects, choosing only those with a story that needed to be told. She and Sophia began to co-teach a sought-after seminar at Harvard on art, ethics, and community. One evening, as they were closing up the studio, Sophia turned to her mother. "You never did finish your own work, you know," she said. Cassie looked at her, puzzled. "What do you mean? You're always restoring other people's visions. When do you get to create your own?" The question hung in the air. Cassie looked at the blank canvases stacked against the wall, untouched for years. She had always seen her role as a guardian of the past. The idea of adding something new, something wholly her own, felt terrifying and exhilarating. The next day, she cleared a fresh space in the studio. She set up a new, blank canvas. She had no idea what she would paint, but for the first time in decades, she was not looking backward. She was looking forward. The restoration of Cassandra Locke was finally complete. The artist was ready to begin. And beside her, her daughter was ready to do the same. Their legacy would not be a single masterpiece, but a world of truth and beauty they had built together, one careful, patient stroke at a time. The blank canvas was a precipice. For over 30 years, Cassandra Locke's world had been defined by the intentions of others, the ghost of a master's stroke, the whisper of a long-dead patron's desire, the corrosive lies of a thief. Her purpose had been to listen, to interpret, to repair. To stand before a pristine, empty surface and impose her own vision was an act of terrifying vulnerability. The weight of the brush in her hand felt different. It was no longer a tool of service, but one of declaration. Sophia watched her mother's hesitation with a knowing smile. She said nothing, simply arranging her own supplies at the adjacent easel. Her presence was no longer that of a student or a subordinate, but of a fellow traveler embarking on a parallel journey. The studio, once a sanctuary for a solitary priestess of preservation, had become a shared atelier. Cassie's first marks were timid, a few hesitant lines of charcoal. They were not the confident underdrawing of a planned composition, but the nervous scratches of someone relearning a forgotten language. She wiped them away with a frustrated sigh. "It doesn't have to mean anything yet, Mom," Sophia said softly, without looking up from her own work, a bold, abstract swirl of color. "It just has to be, it's play. Remember play?" The word was a key. Play was what Leo had encouraged in her. Play was what had been burned out of her by the need for perfection, for professional respect, for survival. She took a deep breath, loaded a large brush with a reckless amount of ultramarine blue, and made a sweeping, impulsive gesture across the canvas. It was messy, it was uncontrolled, it was glorious. That single act of defiance broke the dam. Cassie stopped trying to paint a thing and started painting a feeling. The simmering anger at the aldrich became slashes of vermilion and ochre. The profound peace of the Italian churchyard softened into fields of tranquil green and gold. The fierce, protective love for her daughter emerged as a central, glowing core of warm light. The painting was a map of her own soul, a chaotic, beautiful, and brutally honest confession. While Cassie journeyed inward, the external world of the Locke Foundation continued to evolve under Sophia and Lena's leadership. The Locke Protocol was a success, but it created a new problem: complacency. Major institutions now displayed the seal like a badge of honor, but Sophia's sharp eyes noticed a troubling trend. The foundation was becoming a reactive authenticator, a rubber stamp for the very establishment it was meant to challenge. We've made ethics a marketing tool, she argued in a strategy meeting. They get our seal, they feel good about themselves, and nothing fundamentally changes. We're policing the edges, not transforming the core. Her new idea was radical. She proposed the Lock Index, a dynamic, publicly accessible digital ledger. Using blockchain technology, every artwork handled by a protocol certified entity would have an immutable, publicly visible record. Its full provenance, conservation history, sale prices, and even the terms of its artist's contract would be recorded in a secure, transparent chain. It would be a revolution in an industry built on opacity. Lena was ecstatic. We can code integrity into the system itself. No more lost histories, no more hidden inflations. The art world's old guard reacted with apoplectic fury. Auction houses and elite galleries, whose power depended on controlling information, decried it as a vulgar invasion of privacy, a Stalinist takeover of the market. Even some artists, who enjoyed the myth-making potential of Chinese letter provenance, were wary. The Foundation found itself in a new kind of war, not against a single enemy, but against an entrenched culture of secrecy. It was in the midst of this fierce debate that a new figure entered their orbit: Gabriel Soto. He was a young, visionary tech philanthropist who had made his fortune in ethical data security. He had followed the Locke Foundation's story from the beginning and saw the Locke Index not as a threat, but as the most exciting application of his life's work. He requested a meeting. Sophia, now the Foundation's primary interface with the tech world, took the call. Cassie, from her easel, listened to her daughter's side of the conversation: the sharp, intelligent questions, the confident negotiation of terms. She was no longer the girl pleading for forgiveness. She was a CEO sparring with an equal. Gabriel came to Boston. He was not what they expected. He lacked Adrian's predatory gloss or the Aldrich's patrician coldness. He was intense, brilliant, with a disarming earnestness. He believed in their mission with a zealot's passion. Transparency isn't just about preventing fraud, he told them, his hands animated as he sketched concepts on a digital tablet. It's about creating a new narrative. It's about showing the life of an object. The sweat of the artist, the joy of the first owner, the care of the restorer, that's the real value. The index can tell that story. His technological expertise was the missing piece. He offered his company's resources to build the platform pro bono. The alliance was a powerhouse. Sophia, with her strategic vision and deep understanding of the art world's nuances, and Gabriel, with his ability to turn that vision into unassailable code, became an inseparable team. Cassie watched the relationship blossom with a cautious heart. The scars of Adrian were deep, but Gabriel was different. He looked at Sophia not as a prize or a means to an end, but as a partner in a shared crusade. He treated her ideas with reverence and her foundation with respect. The development of the Locke Index was all-consuming. Sophia and Gabriel spent long nights in the Foundation's offices, their heads bent over lines of code and complex ethical frameworks. Cassie, meanwhile, was deep in her own creative struggle. Her painting was taking shape, a tumultuous, beautiful landscape of her internal world. She found the process emotionally draining and exhilarating in equal measure. The strain of their separate battles created a subtle distance between mother and daughter. They were together in the studio every day, but Sophia's mind was often in the digital future, while Cassie's was buried in the primal past of color and form. The easy rhythm they had found was disrupted. The crisis came from an unexpected direction. A powerful coalition of old money collectors and auction houses, threatened by the index, launched a preemptive strike. They funded a smear campaign, planting stories in pliable financial press outlets. The articles questioned Gabriel Soto's motives, suggesting he was using the foundation to harvest valuable art market data for his own company. They painted Sophia as a naive idealist, a puppet of a tech opportunist, and Cassie as a fading figurehead, out of touch and manipulated by her daughter's dangerous new ally. The accusations were lies, but they were expertly crafted and devastatingly effective. Donations to the foundation slowed. Protocol memberships were put on hold. Gabriel's investors grew nervous. The foundation's board pressured Sophia to sever ties with Gabriel. The appearance of conflict is enough to destroy us, one of them argued during a tense video call. Sophia, cornered and furious, retreated. She became cold, professional, putting a formal distance between herself and Gabriel. She was determined to save the foundation, even if it meant sacrificing the most promising connection she'd made since her ordeal began. Cassie saw it all unfolding. She saw the light in her daughter's eyes dimming, the old walls of self-protection going back up. She saw history threatening to repeat itself, not through malice but through fear. She knew what she had to do. It was time for the restorer of truth to speak. She called a press conference. She did not invite the board. She did not script a statement. She stood at the podium, not as the director of a foundation, but as a mother and an artist. Behind her, she displayed not charts or graphs, but an image of her nearly finished painting, a raw, emotional, and undeniably powerful work. "They are telling you that my daughter is naive," she began, her voice quiet but clear, carrying through the silent room. "They say she is being manipulated. They are wrong. Sophia Locke is the most clear-eyed, courageous person I know. She has stared into the face of greed and corruption, and instead of becoming cynical, she decided to build a better system." She then turned to the accusations against Gabriel. "They are using the same old playbook. When a woman shows strength, they call her a puppet. When a man shows integrity, they question his motives. Gabriel Soto has offered us not just his technology, but his faith. And we have rewarded that faith with suspicion." She paused, letting her words hang in the air. "The Locke Foundation is not a corporation. It is a promise. A promise I made to my uncle and my daughter made to me. We will not break that promise because of lies whispered by men who are afraid of the light. The Locke Index will move forward. My daughter's leadership is not up for debate. And if you have a problem with that," she said, her gaze sweeping the room, "you can answer to me." It was not a legal argument, it was a moral one. Delivered with the unwavering authority of a woman who had nothing left to prove, it was electrifying. The smear campaign collapsed under the weight of her conviction. The board fell in line, chastened. Donations not only resumed, they skyrocketed. That night, Sophia came to the studio. She didn't speak. She just walked over to her mother and hugged her, really hugged her, for the first time since before Adrian. The last vestige of shame and debt between them finally dissolved. "Thank you," Sophia whispered. "You never needed me to fight for you," Cassie said, stroking her hair. "You just needed to know I always would." The Locke Index launched to global acclaim. It was a paradigm shift. Gabriel, vindicated, became a permanent partner, his relationship with Sophia deepening into a powerful love built on mutual respect and a shared mission. Cassie finished her painting. She titled it Reclamation. It was her first original work in 3 decades. It was not for sale. She hung it in the foundation's lobby, a permanent reminder that their work was not just about the past, but about the courage to create a new future. One afternoon, Cassie found Sophia and Gabriel in the garden behind the studio. They were laughing, looking at plans not for the index, but for a small, sustainable house they wanted to build. Sophia's hand rested gently on her still flat stomach. She didn't need to say anything. The future was right there, growing in the light. Cassie smiled, feeling a peace so profound it was almost dizzying. The studio was busy, the foundation was changing the world, and her daughter was happy and safe. The ghosts were finally at rest. She picked up a brush. There was a new canvas waiting.